All right, friends, we are on chapter 7 called Fogbound. The last thing that happened was Brother Michael gave the book that Jack and Annie were looking for to them so that they could escape with it and take it back to the magic treehouse. So let's see what happens. Chapter 7. As the rocks, the seagull At the rocks, the seagulls still screeched. Jack could barely see the steep path leading down into the fog. Go slowly, Jack whispered to Annie as they started down. Whoops, said Annie. She slipped and fell forward, bumping into Jack. My foot got caught in my dress. Shh, said Jack. He held on to Annie. They listened as pebbles and rocks rolled down the cliff. Jack took a deep breath. We've got to watch out for Vikings, too, he said. They started down the steep path again. They went one step at a time. The sounds of the waves against the rocks grew louder. Finally, they stepped down onto a flat strip of pebbles. Where are we? Whispered Annie. I don't know, said Jack. Oh, look, said Annie. She pointed to the shoreline. Through the fog rose the serpent prows of the Viking ships. Jack and Annie crept closer to the ships. Their sails were down. Each ship had been tied to a tall, jagged rock. They seemed deserted as they bobbed in the shallow waves. Jack really wanted to check out the ships, but he was afraid of wasting time. We'd better find the treehouse, he said to Annie. They crept away from the 3 Viking ships. Suddenly, they both froze. Through the mist, they saw a group of Viking warriors. The Vikings were looking at the top of the cliff. Their long yellow hair hung down from beneath their iron helmets. They carried round wooden shields and swords and axes. It looks like they're planning to climb the cliff, said Annie. We need to hide until they go, said Jack. Then we can look for the treehouse. Let's hide in a ship, said Annie. Good idea, said Jack. They crept back to where the ships were tied. There's those Vikings. Jack was happy to see that the sides of the smallest ship were very low. They would easily be able to climb over them. You go first, said Annie. Jack waded through the shallow water. It was cold. He reached the ship and grabbed one side. He pushed himself up and onto the ship's deck. The ship jerked forward. Jack looked at the shore. It was now 30 feet away. The ship's anchoring rope was pulled tight. The serpent prow bobbed up and down with the waves. The fog and the movement of the ship made Jack feel as if he were in a dream. For a moment, he forgot to be scared of the Vikings. This is so cool, he called. Come on, Annie. Annie started to wade out to the ship. Suddenly, she disappeared. Annie? Called Jack. Her head popped out of the water. She splashed her arms. It's deep, she gasped. My dress, it's too heavy. Use the rope, said Jack, like when we climbed the stairs. Annie grabbed the rope that stretched from the ship to the shore. It held her weight as she began inching along it. Hold on tight, cried Jack. I am, said Annie. She kept going hand over hand along the rope toward the ship. When Annie got close to the ship, Jack reached out to help her. As he pulled her in, the side of the ship dipped down. Then the rope went slack, and their ship slid out to sea. Chapter 8, Lost at Sea. Annie fell to the deck of the ship. Jack pulled the rope out of the water. The end of it was still tied in a loop. What happened? Asked Annie. We're headed out to sea, said Jack. I guess all the pulling lifted the rope off the rock. Annie sat up and looked at the misty whiteness. I can't see the island, she said. I can't see anything, said Jack. Annie looked at Jack. Do you think this is our darkest hour? She asked. I don't know, said Jack. Maybe the book will help. He pulled out their research book. He found a picture of a Viking ship. He read the caption out loud. Viking ships were the best ships of their time. When there was no wind, the crew would take down the sails and row with oars. The smallest ships had 4 rowers, and the largest had as many as 32. Rowers sat on boxes that stored their belongings. Great, said Annie, jumping up. This isn't our darkest hour. Why do you say that? Asked Annie. There's still hope, said Annie. We can row to the other side of the island and find the treehouse. And here's that Viking ship with the serpent prow that they were talking about at the beginning of the book. Are you nuts? Said Jack. Please, Jack, said Annie. Can we just try? She grabbed one of the oars. She could barely lift it. It was so heavy. Forget it, Annie, said Jack. It takes 4 big Viking guys to row this thing. You're too little. I'm too little. Come on, Jack. Just try, said Annie. You get an oar too. We'll sit on boxes across from each other. Oh, brother, said Jack. Annie dragged her long oar over to a storage box. I'm not doing this alone, she said. Jack groaned. Then he dragged an oar to the box across from Annie. Cool, said Annie. She looked in a storage box. Look, one for each of us. She lifted out 2 small Viking helmets. Maybe these were made for Viking kids who sometimes ride in this ship, said Annie. Maybe, said Jack. He hadn't thought of Vikings as real people before. People with families and little kids. Annie pulled off her scarf and put a helmet on her head. Now I feel like a Viking too, she said. I bet it will help me row. She handed Jack a helmet. He put it on. It did make him feel a little different too. I don't know about this, he said. The helmet wasn't as heavy as the one he had worn in the time of castles, but it was still pretty heavy. Well, I'm braver with mine on, said Annie. Jack smiled. He didn't know how Annie could be braver than she already was. Ready to row, she asked. Yup, said Jack. He was feeling braver himself. The wind picked up as Jack lifted his heavy oar over the side of the ship. He lowered it into the water, but the current was so strong that the oar was ripped from his hands. Jack fell over backwards as his oar slipped into the sea. I lost my oar, Annie yelled. Jack looked up as rain started to fall. The sky was black. A gush of seawater poured over the side of the ship. Brr, said Annie as she tried to stand. The black sky shook with thunder and flashed with lightning. Jack crawled to the side of the ship and pulled himself up. Another huge wave was coming right toward them. It's our darkest hour now, cried Annie. Get Brother Michael's book. Jack reached into his leather bag. He pulled out the jeweled book and held it up. Save us, Story, he cried. He looked at the sea again. What he saw made him scream. Rising from the oncoming wave was a giant sea serpent. And that's the end of chapter 8. Tomorrow we'll read chapter 9 called Sea Monster. Have a great rest and have a great day, and we'll read more tomorrow. Bye.